welcome back for another episode of Discern with Denison Forum. I am Ross and joined this week by Mark Turman. Welcome back in, Mark.
Hey, Ross. Good to see you. Looking forward to our chat and hope you're having a good week.
I am. Thank you. We're doing a series this week I'm really enjoying on entertainment, and it's focusing around what are we watching, what are we reading, and why do we watch those things as we continue to be engaged in the culture and just really try to unpack motivations behind why we do things and then understand biblically what's good about those things, what's not as good, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities. We've queued up several topics that are relevant to today, which is all about the show Yellowstone. And so a really key topic in this show is sort of what drives man. And so the lead character, John Dutton, is the head of a family ranch that's been in his family for years. And it's truly seemingly the driving motivation for him is to protect the land. And so there's this really central theme of man seeking after and pursuing something to own and possess. Can you speak to why that resonates with us?
What's appealing to it, what seems to be interesting to it, is this idea of frontier spirit, going into the Pacific Northwest, into that area of the country that kind of seemingly feels like one of the last undeveloped areas of our country. And the idea of a legacy ranch kind of appeals to us, and that American spirit that we are acquainted with at different times in our culture. It's kind of interesting. Yellowstone, some other shows as well, some other movies coming back around to this kind of Western culture, frontier idea. But I think there is this ambition in us, and it's been a part of really what founded America, is this being entrepreneurial and gaining something that other people don't have, being the first person there, and then being able to claim something for yourself and to hold on to it. There's obviously issues of prominence and importance that are attached to that. We find value in what we achieve and what we gain. We find identity in that to a certain degree. And then also this idea of creating a legacy that will live on past your own life as you pass something down, like a land or a business even, and passing that on to your children, your grandchildren, and having a sense that, well, I live on even if my physical life stops. Well, this thing that I created, that I started, that I put together lives on past me, gives us some sense of feeling like we're living on into eternity, I think.
The seeking out of the land itself and the process of that, I guess, is so appealing in the show that they've now gone and made a spin-off series called 1883, which I have watched, and I'm going to read from Esquire. 1883 follows the Dutton family as they make their way from the heart of Texas to the Montana ranch, where the set and present-day series is based. Leading the way is James Dillon Dutton, played by Tim McGraw, and Shay Brennan, played by Sam Elliott, accompanied by the Dutton matriarch, Margaret, played by Hill. Again, all three pretty prominent actors. You know, Sam Elliott, of Tombstone fame. He makes the show, authentically a Western Hollywood experience just by him being in it. The show, though, is really about how they came from the characters have different backgrounds, but the Dutton family came from a reasonably well-situated position in the East. And part of the show is them going through the Oregon Trail, movement, and how truly awful and terrible that was in a lot of real harsh ways. And it's dealing with why would they do that, And so it's interesting to just think about what the pioneers went through to get to that land, even some coming from a seemingly good situation.
Yeah, and I think it ties a little bit to what we talked about in our last episode, this idea of looking forward, but also looking back. It's interesting that they have already done a spinoff that takes you into kind of prequel mode into where did this actually start in an earlier time? This Is Us does that, and other shows as well. This idea that you find in human beings of where are my roots, and answering some of the big questions of life. Where did I come from? How did I get here? And why am I here? Those are core questions of understanding and identity that we all face. And you see that in other ways in our culture, the prominence these days of things like Ancestry.com and chasing out. I know that when my dad got into his 60s, this became very important to him of understanding in an even deeper way, what is my family tree? Where are my roots? What were the people thinking that caused them to make decisions, particularly these big pivotal decisions of, hey, I'm going to move out of this part of the developed world and I'm going to take the risk of what pioneers were willing to endure. And you got to think that they did that in part because of reports and recommendations. Kind of, we talk about finding your next new show or going to a movie because it was recommended to you by a lot of people. But that's also been true with us for a long time, the ability to influence each other this way, of people saying, hey, you've got this kind of life here in the East as the country developed, but what if you went and started something new? What if you went to a brand new place and you created something that hadn't ever existed before? How would you feel about that? What would be powerful in your life in that way? And I think all of us have a certain element of that, where we want to be a part of something that hasn't existed yet, or we want to see things that we haven't ever seen before. And that is a spirit of adventure. We all have some of it. Others have a lot of it. And I think that's just part of what it means to be a human being.
Yeah, and C.S. Lewis, and I can't recall the exact words, but he talks a lot about that longing that's deep-seated in us that was put there for a reason.
Yeah, he says something along that lines of, if I find a longing in me that cannot be satisfied in this world, then that would make me think I've been built for another world, because I have this longing in me that no matter what I achieve or what I pursue, what my adventures might lead me to in this world, I still have this longing. Even if I'm successful being a pioneer, getting from the East Coast all the way to Montana or all the way to California, I get there and I pursue my ambition. I follow out this adventure and great things happen, hard things happen, but I still find this longing in me. And kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, this longing for eternity that, as Lewis said, we've been made for a world that this world can't satisfy.
Yeah, and two hard topics the show really meets head on that I think is good to address as you watch the show and to understand and appreciate is John Dutton, you can argue, and the show plays out in a lot of these ways, puts so much into the protection of the land and the longing of protecting what he longed for and what his family and ancestors longed for, that he in many ways misses the mark on that. We mentioned in a prior episode, resume virtues versus legacy virtues. Okay, you ended up with the land, but what is the state of your relationships in your family? That's one of the fascinating things about the show, is watching the family and what happens amidst trying to keep all that land. That's one caution from the show, is what are you valuing, and what's happening when you're trying to protect that legacy as land? What's happening with the relationships?
Yeah, and I think it has a lot to do with what are your motivations. The Bible talks a lot about this, not simply about what you're doing, but why you're doing it. And that may be reflected in Dutton's character of, is it really about the land? Is it really about stewarding and protecting this incredible place? Or is it really about his own ambition? Is it about his own sense of identity and achievement? And is it about him destroying relationships in order to protect that in a selfish sense, rather than doing it for a more noble purpose, rather than doing it for the sake of preserving something that is beautiful and that is the handiwork of God? What's really his motivation? And the little bit I know about the show is you can kind of see that tension playing out. And what has he done? What is he willing to do in terms of, abusing people or running over people in order to not only get what he wants, but to hang on to what he has gotten?
Absolutely. And having watched it, you as a believer, you're not going to point to John Dutton and say that he is fully wholesome, and all of us have sin, but certainly his motivations lead him to commit atrocities. And so in the name of protecting the family, but is that the right, is that a good motivation for doing what's done? Clearly not. And there's examples of that play out in the show. Another conflict point that it brings to the surface, which I think is super important and good because it raises important questions, is what happened with the Native Americans during the time of 1883 through the present, who were displaced? How were they treated? It really gets into those issues and really meets them head on. And does it depict everything accurately as it happens? I cannot speak to that. But what I do know is it raises important questions that we can have in our home of, hey, do you know that it wasn't just we settled the West and there it was, and here's this beautiful country. There was a lot going on, and there was, again, atrocities committed there as well. And even in the news last week, we've seen atrocities against Native Americans that were continually being revealed in Canada. These are important parts of our history. It's good for us to know, ask questions, learn more about.
Yeah, I think so. And obviously raising those kinds of topics that go into other parts of our history and relate to things like racism that we generally talk about from the standpoint of the African American culture in America, which is important. Sometimes that causes certain parts of our culture, certain parts of our community to tense up as to sometimes say, well, you're just trying to rewrite history. It may be in some cases that's what some are trying to do. As I try to listen into this conversation, whether it's in the sense of relationships with African Americans in the community there, or Latinos and Hispanics, or whether it's the conversation about Native Americans, I don't think it's about so much rewriting history as it is adding in more chapters or adding in more pages. That when you're teaching history and you're teaching about what happened in the previous decades and centuries of our country and our communities, you have to be selective. You can't put all of it into a history book. You'd never be able to get through the book, right? But as we move along, I do think it's valuable for us to learn more and more of those kinds of stories.
Despite it having unsavory characters and unsavory acts, Yellowstone does put forth a lot of questions about what chapters need to be, analyzed and which ones need to be added, for example. So really enjoy the conversation on this, Mark, and I enjoy looking at the things that we're watching and seeing, what motivates us to watch them, and again, what can we pull out and discern from them that's helpful to us and our faith, to our families, and to ask these challenging questions. So I appreciate the time, Mark.
You bet. I enjoy it too, and hope our audience is benefiting as well.
We're going to continue this conversation about what we are watching with something that I think almost everybody's seen a piece of, which is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So we'll be back on the next episode to talk about that right here on Discern.